Hello, geography students. Well, in the last lecture, we talked about Israel and Jordan. And I'm sure you expected to hear more about countries around them in this lecture. And you will. But the direction we're going first is to the west. Now, you might remember that very early on in our class, we talked about imagined regions. These are things that don't have a clearly defined physical boundary. Instead, there's something people carry around strictly in their heads. And one crucially important imagined region in the world, for Americans especially, is the Middle East. Now, I'm sure you've heard the expression, the Middle East, pretty much all your lives. But exactly what the Middle East means as a region is a tough one. For example, if I asked you before you took this class, name 3 Middle Eastern countries, I would bet you'd say probably Saudi Arabia. I would bet you'd say Israel. For religious reasons, Americans tend to know about Israel. But there's also Saudi Arabia, which, looms pretty large in the imagination. Arabia with its fields of sand dunes that go on forever and its incredible heat and the oil. I suspect those are 2 countries that almost all Americans would instantly associate with the Middle East. But I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if the 3rd place country in Americans' imagination in the Middle East was Egypt. Because we all have grown up on mummy movies and maybe the occasional documentary about Egypt and the like. But how does that fit? Because you remember, what continent were Israel and Saudi Arabia on? Asia. What continent is Egypt on? Africa. Egypt is on the continent of Africa, right? So we see here, this is the Red Sea right here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This tiny little country right here is Israel. And this country right here is Jordan. So the last lecture was about this. And there's the West Bank, an even tinier little area. But that is Egypt. And that right there is the dividing line between Asia and Africa. Today, that dividing line has the Suez Canal there, the Suez Canal. And we'll have to come back and talk about the Suez Canal in a minute. But that's a man-made canal. It's not a channel, but it was dug at a place that would be a natural breaking point in your mind, a low area, only about 75 miles of dirt with the Red Sea and an inlet of it right here, and the Mediterranean Sea here, all of Africa. This is that giant continent of Africa, and this is the very southwesternmost edge of Asia, and that's where they almost failed to touch. It's only about 75 miles at Suez, right there. But Egypt is on the continent of Africa, all except for this bit of mountainous desert land called the Sinai Peninsula. Now that's important, again, religious-wise. Religious reasons, Moses and the 10 Commandments and all that on Mount Sinai. It was somewhere on this. The traditional site is in the south at a place called Gebel Musa. Moses is a mountain in Arabic. But, this country of Egypt, why does it qualify for the Middle East if it is not in Asia like Israel and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Iraq? We talked about them. They are Arab countries, but they're in Asia. Now, the reason why Egypt counts as part of the Middle East is twofold. One, the people in Egypt today speak Arabic. Now, their ancient ancestors did not. Please don't misunderstand. Arabic came to Egypt with the Muslim invasions of the 630s AD. Before that, Coptic and Greek were the languages of Egypt, and in very ancient times, it was an ancestor of the Coptic language known as Ancient Egyptian, which isn't related in any way, shape, or form to Arabic. But with the coming of Islam and Arab armies to Egypt in the 630s AD, they swallowed up Egypt, made it part of the Muslim state, and they slowly, the second reason why Egypt is usually considered by Americans part of the Middle East, is the religion of people there today, which more than 90% of Egyptians practice Islam. And again, outside of Israel, the majority of every Middle Eastern country is Muslim. So that Arab-speaking Muslims make up way over 90% of the population of Egypt. It's kind of natural for Americans to think of Egypt as part of the Middle East. But if Egypt qualifies as Middle East because even though it's in Africa, how about Libya? How about Algeria and Tunisia? And we can even slide further and see Morocco right here. So this is the entire northern piece of Africa. It is a portion of Africa known in Arabic as the Maghreb. The Maghreb. The Maghreb is this northern tier of Africa, the inhabited portion of which is right on the Mediterranean. Look at the cities that I can point to: Cairo, Alexandria, Benghazi, Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, Tangier, Casablanca. Do you see any cities down here at all? No, you don't. And there's a reason for that. That is very fierce desert, and it becomes the Sahara Desert, the most famous desert on earth, right? The Sahara Desert. So the Maghreb is that coastal plain, about 100 to 150 miles wide, that leads to the Mediterranean in the north and is bounded by the Sahara Desert on the south. And the overwhelming majority of people who live in Egypt, in Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco live very near or on the Mediterranean coast. I made a slight slip of the tongue when I said Egypt. The majority of people do live in northern Egypt. That's called Lower Egypt because it's the lowest part of the Nile River. The Nile flows from south to north. That kind of messes with your head if you're an American, because all of our major rivers flow from the north to the south. A couple of them flow east-west, but none of our major rivers in the United States flow from the south to the north because of the shape of the continent of North America. But the continent of Africa has its highest mountains in the middle of it, which means rivers tend to flow into the Mediterranean from the south toward the north. So this is the lower Nile, and this is the upper Nile. It's higher in the south and lower in the north. Obviously, it's at sea level in the north. Mediterranean Sea, right? But anyway, the reason I made a misstep, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco over on the coast over here, those people live almost entirely right by the Mediterranean Sea. But in Egypt, as the ancient historian Herodotus said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. So while most modern Egyptians live here between Alexandria and Cairo, there are other major cities in the south because of the Nile River. And agriculture exists in Egypt in significant quantity because of the Nile River. From ancient times to the present, it's farmland. Now, in the late 1960s, the Egyptians built a large dam that stopped the annual flooding of the Nile. But of course, now they have motorized pumps to pump the water out of the Nile, so you don't have to depend on the natural flood like their ancestors did. And it means that Egypt is a moderately agriculturally productive region. Now, unfortunately, today they have a population that is far larger than they could easily feed with just the Nile. So Egypt is not a terribly prosperous country because of tourism. I mean, a lot of people, I've never been to Egypt, but I would love to go to Egypt. A lot of people from the West go there, and so tourism is a major part of the Egyptian economy. And if you're involved in the tourism industry and things related to it, you might could have a pretty good living in Egypt. But most people, of course, don't do that. And so many Egyptians are still poor. Egypt does not have one blessing of the Middle East. It does not have meaningful oil reserves or gas reserves. Libya and Algeria, on the other hand, in their south. I said almost nobody lives down here in the south of Libya and Algeria. Well, almost nobody. It's very hot desert conditions there. And there are some Bedouins, of course, but you will find settlements of people working in the oil industry. With being able to bring in water and air conditioning, it's possible to survive, 130, 140 degree Fahrenheit summer days in the Sahara. And the reason they do it is there is oil under that sand there. Egypt has virtually none, but Libya and Algeria here do get wealth from oil and gas. Now, Egypt, as I said, while not a prosperous country, does have a tourism draw, which makes it part of the consciousness of the West in a special way. You've all studied ancient Egypt in class, I'm sure. And so Americans and other Europeans know about Egypt, they want to visit Egypt and the like. Today, you will find almost nobody would want to visit Libya. Libya was under the heel of a terrible dictator named Muammar Gaddafi for the better part, I think, more than 30 years. Gaddafi was a man who liked to thumb his nose at the Western world, at the United States and our friends. And sometimes he did things that might make you wonder whether he was sane or not. But he kept absolute control of Libya under dictatorship for decades. About 6 years ago, as part of the Arab Spring, there was an uprising against Gaddafi, and he was actually killed by rebels. But the problem is, in Libya, the various rebel armies started fighting each other. And to this day, years later, I think it is more than 6 years now, the government of Libya is a patchwork, cobbled together, temporary affair that has very little real authority over most of the country. It's lucky when its authority runs to the biggest cities right up on the coast, but even there, their orders aren't always followed. There are half a dozen sizable armed forces in the country with no real loyalty to the central government at all. It is what is known as a failed state, And the rule of law, very questionable in Libya. Do not go there. But there are certain armed groups that have gained control of these oil reserves, and they keep them open enough that they get money off of that. So there is some semblance of order, but it's not a central government that's providing it. It's the desire to keep things calm enough that they can sell the oil and make money. Algeria had a strongman government, but they semi-democratized during the Arab Spring about 6 years ago. Tunisia has a democratic government. Their dictator was overthrown in the Arab Spring 6 years ago, and they did get a democracy out of it. So Tunisia and Algeria both are relatively peaceful countries, unlike Libya. And you can go there to visit. Some Europeans do treat them as resort areas. The French were once the colonial masters of these three countries. And so a lot of Frenchmen go there. A lot of people in Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco speak French. So it's a more European friendly, although they are also a Muslim country, an Arab speaking country. They're a little more friendly to Europeans and Westerners generally in those countries. Morocco is a peaceful kingdom. It is very friendly to the United States. It is not a genuine democracy. It's a kingdom. The king of Morocco wields real power. He's not just a figurehead like Queen Elizabeth of England. They have a parliament, but it's advisory to him. But he is still apparently fairly well beloved of his people. So you have something like genuine democracy in Tunisia and Algeria, and a popular king that rules Morocco. Libya is a chaos. There is a general who seized power in a coup d'etat in Egypt a couple of years ago, but he has imposed order on the country. So unless you are a fundamentalist Muslim activist, most Egyptians seem content with a general who, gets elected president because most of the opponents are afraid to run against him. But at least he has restored calmness and order to the country, and most middle-class Egyptians seem to care for him better than what they had. If you had free and fair elections, a fundamentalist Muslim group somewhat associated with terrorism might well win because of those poor people we talked about. The poor often want some kind of radical change in society, hoping it'll be better for them. The middle class seldom wants revolutions, though. And so the military backs the middle class demand for stability and order and restored tourism. Your assignment on North Africa will be to do a little research on the most popular tourist attraction in Egypt, the Great Pyramids at Giza. Please do a little basic research on the history of the Great Pyramids at Giza. You can check my communications page on GradeLink. It'll tell you about this, and give it to me by the end of the week. Write up a short thing on the history and why tourism flourishes, what do tourists want to see there at the Great Pyramids at Giza. Thanks. We'll move on to the rest of the Middle East in Southwest Asia in the next lecture. Thank you.